You've heard of the Black Death. You've heard of smallpox. You've heard of the Spanish flu. You know the plague narrative. A disease arrives, millions die, civilization staggers, eventually recovers. That's the story we tell about disease and history. But there's another story. Older, quieter, more patient than any plague. A disease that didn't arrive in a single catastrophic wave and leave. A disease that was simply always there, woven into the fabric of daily life in every major civilization on Earth, shaping architecture and agriculture and religion and warfare and urban planning and trade routes, and the very way humans organize themselves into societies for thousands of years before anyone understood what it was. It's not the plague. It's not smallpox. It's not cholera. It's malaria. And the story of what it actually did to human civilization is one of the most important stories nobody ever told you. Let's go. First, let's establish something that most people don't fully appreciate. Malaria is old. Genuinely, incomprehensibly old. The parasite that causes the most lethal form of human malaria, Plasmodium falciparum, has been infecting humans for somewhere between 50,000 and 100,000 years. Possibly longer. We found malaria DNA in Egyptian mummies dating to 3,200 years ago. We found genetic evidence of malaria selection pressure in human populations going back tens of thousands of years. Ancient Sanskrit medical texts from India describe a disease with symptoms matching malaria in striking detail, dating to roughly 600 BC. The ancient Greeks called it the king of diseases. Hippocrates wrote entire chapters on its seasonal patterns and clinical presentation. This wasn't a disease that occasionally visited human civilization. It was a disease that human civilization was built around. Every major ancient society that developed in a warm, wet climate, Egypt, Mesopotamia, Greece, Rome, India, China, Sub-Saharan Africa, Mesoamerica, developed directly in the optimal ecological zone for the Anopheles mosquito that carries malaria. Not coincidentally, because those same warm, wet, low-lying areas near water sources that made mosquitoes thrive were also the most agriculturally productive land on Earth. Humans needed the fertile ground. The mosquitoes came with it. And then, quietly, relentlessly, malaria started shaping everything. Let's start with Rome, because Rome is where the evidence is most dramatic and most documented. The Roman Campagna, the flat, low-lying agricultural land surrounding Rome itself, was among the most malaria-infested regions in the ancient world. The Romans called it Malaria, literally, bad air, because they correctly observed that the disease came from swampy, low-lying areas, even though they had no idea why. They assumed it was something in the air itself. The miasma theory. Wrong mechanism, right observation. What malaria did to Rome was not dramatic. It didn't kill in the sudden, catastrophic way of a plague. It killed slowly, chronically. It weakened. It recurred. A person infected with P. falciparum would experience fever cycles, anemia, organ damage, cognitive impairment. They might survive the initial infection and be reinfected repeatedly throughout their lives, each episode leaving them slightly more compromised than before. The Roman military, the most effective killing machine the ancient world had ever produced, had a malaria problem so severe that entire legions stationed in the Campania were routinely decimated not by enemy action, but by fever season. Commanders planned campaigns around it. Julius Caesar himself was almost certainly a malaria sufferer. Ancient sources describe him experiencing recurring episodes of fever and shaking throughout his life, a clinical pattern consistent with chronic P. vivax infection. But here's the part that goes beyond individual suffering. Malaria fundamentally shaped Roman urban planning. The Romans built their city on hills, the famous 7 hills of Rome, not for strategic defense as is often assumed, but because the hills were above the mosquito zones. The wealthy lived at elevation. The poor lived in the low-lying areas near the Tiber, and the poor died of malaria at dramatically higher rates than the wealthy. Malaria was, for most of Roman history, a class disease, a geography of poverty disease. The kind of disease that kills the people nobody writes histories about. Now, let's go further back, because Rome is recent compared to what malaria did to Egypt. The Nile Delta, the most agriculturally productive land in the ancient world, the foundation of Egyptian civilization, was a perfect malaria environment. Warm, slow-moving water, dense vegetation, year-round mosquito breeding conditions. And the evidence of what this meant for ancient Egyptians is written directly into their bodies. Researchers analyzing ancient Egyptian mummies have found not just malaria DNA, but evidence of sickle cell trait at elevated frequencies in ancient Egyptian populations. Sickle cell trait, carrying one copy of the sickle cell gene rather than two, provides significant partial resistance to P. falciparum malaria. It's a brutal evolutionary trade-off. The gene that protects against malaria in double copy causes sickle cell disease. In single copy, it saves you from malaria while causing only mild symptoms. The presence of elevated sickle cell frequencies in ancient Egyptian populations is direct genetic evidence that malaria selection pressure was intense enough for long enough to shape the Egyptian genome. The disease was so omnipresent, so consistently lethal, that the human body literally rewired itself to survive it. That same genetic signature, sickle cell trait elevated in populations with long histories of malaria exposure, appears across sub-Saharan Africa, the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and South Asia. Wherever the Anopheles mosquito thrived for thousands of years, the human genome carries the mark. Here's where we need to address the skeptic, because there's a legitimate pushback worth taking seriously. Attributing the shape of civilizations to a single disease is always a simplification. Rome fell for many reasons. Egypt's social structure emerged from many pressures. Reducing complex historical causation to malaria did it would be as misleading as the myths we're trying to correct. Fair. Completely fair. Malaria wasn't the only force shaping these civilizations. But here's the distinction worth making. Most historical forces, wars, famines, political collapses, are events. They happen, they have effects, they end. Malaria wasn't an event. It was a condition. A permanent background pressure that every single person in affected regions lived under every year for their entire lives. That kind of chronic, inescapable pressure doesn't cause a single dramatic change. It shapes everything slowly over millennia. The architecture, the agriculture, the calendar, the religion. Ancient Indian Ayurvedic texts prescribe specific herbs for fever with chills, including Artemisia, the plant from which the modern antimalarial artemisinin is derived, over 2,000 years ago. They didn't know what malaria was, but they figured out, through centuries of trial and lethal error, what partially worked against it. That accumulated medical knowledge is itself a product of malaria's presence. Chinese medical texts from the Han Dynasty describe the same cyclical fever patterns, the same seasonal associations, the same herbal interventions, independently, on the other side of the world, because malaria was there too, selecting for the same solutions through the same brutal mechanism. Now let's zoom all the way out, because here's what malaria's history actually means for how we understand the modern world. Malaria didn't just shape ancient civilizations. It shaped the modern ones too, in ways that reach directly into the present. The colonization of the Americas, Africa, and Asia by European powers was partly enabled by differential malaria immunity. West African populations had higher rates of sickle cell trait and other genetic malaria resistance, which is part of why enslaved Africans were specifically trafficked to work in the malaria-endemic lowlands of the American South and Caribbean. European colonizers died of malaria in those regions at devastating rates. Enslaved Africans, on average, survived longer. Their survival was then used to justify enslavement. A genetic adaptation to a disease, shaped over thousands of years of African malaria exposure, was turned into the biological justification for one of the greatest crimes in human history. Malaria's fingerprints are everywhere if you know where to look. In the genetic structure of modern human populations, in the architecture of ancient cities, in the pharmacological traditions of every civilization that developed in a warm climate, in the political geography of colonialism, in the fact that the World Health Organization still lists malaria as one of the leading causes of death in the world today, killing hundreds of thousands of people annually, mostly children under 5, in sub-Saharan Africa. The plague came and went. Smallpox came and went. Malaria never went anywhere. It was there before the first city was built. It was there when Rome was at its height. It was there when European ships crossed the Atlantic. It is there right now, in the bodies of children who will never make the history books, shaping the genetics of populations that won't understand why for another 1,000 years. The disease nobody taught you about is the one that never stopped teaching us. Every civilization you've ever learned about was built in its shadow. Every human genome carries its signature. Every medical tradition on Earth developed at least partly in response to it. It was always the background. It was always the pressure. It was always there. We just forgot to mention it.